Okay, so today the big topics are well, the one that's scheduled as the subject matter of today is the issue of ethics in astrological counseling and research. But I want to kind of, and that's certainly accurate, but I want to kind of rephrase it, reframe it almost, by speaking of this as the importance of care in astrology. And by care, I mean care for the cosmos, for the anima mundi, care for astrology, for the tradition, for its future, care for a client that you might be counseling, if that's the context, care for our audience, if we're giving a lecture, or our students, our care also for our friends, our family, who are often asking our advice about something, their charts, their transits, etc., and care for truth and care for ourselves. Those are that's kind of what's informing the whole picture here. And I want to suggest that in a way, behind all these forms of care that are important for ethical, responsible practice of astrology that is faithful to its the gift that it is. Behind it all is what I think of as a kind of care for the earth, that the cosmos shows our earth, and as a moving center of meaning, which is a very different frame of reference than the conventional decentered post-Copernican universe, where we are just a spinning planet of not especially unique qualities, except that we find ourselves here. And I mean, they are special qualities in a number of respects, but not unique, more than likely. And but above all, it's seen as being a kind of randomly evolved piece of rock, moving through the cosmos around the sun, moving itself through the galaxy, and so forth. And all the correlations that we study here are suggestive of a kind of care, like an act of love by the cosmos for the earth, a kind of attentiveness to it, a bathing it in kind of in symbolic significance, and giving human beings a capacity to orient themselves and have better understanding of who they are as individuals, how they are embedded in a larger collective psyche of a human quality, but also embedded in the larger anima mundi itself. And in all those respects, that's a kind of care for us and for the earth that the cosmos is kind of bathing us with in a continuous way, that I'm suggesting can be reciprocated by our care for that gift. And it's a kind of an act of love in return. All the like we have annual conferences here called the Cosmology of Love conferences, and this is, I think, very vivid evidence, what we explore every week or every day if we're doing this in our own lives, of a cosmos in which some kind of love and care is being expressed. One that is not without its challenges, but what love relationship have you ever been in that didn't have that? And in some respects gives us a sense of the deeper meanings of our lives and of our embeddedness in a cosmos in which we don't seem to be an entirely random epiphenomenon. So that's behind, like, the title, the ethics of, or the ethical issues in the area of astrological counseling and research, is really the issue of care, care for those we are speaking to, care for our ourselves, care for the tradition and the gift of it, and for the aspiration for truth. Let me say that, I'm not sure if I mentioned this ever, but there's a phrase that Gregory Bateson once used when I asked him if he could give the opening talk in a series of lectures at Esalen Institute, where more like convivia that we were having back in the late 70s, dating myself 40 years back there. And he was living there at the time at Fritz's. By the way, that was during Jerry Brown's first administration, dating him as well. And he would be there. Linda Ronstadt would come down with Jerry Brown sometimes and stay at where Gregory was staying in Fritz Perls' house in the guest bedroom, because Gregory was basically a kind of mentor for Jerry Brown in terms of his ecological and epistemological education and so forth. But anyway, Gregory's response was, he said he'd be happy to do it, and he said the title will be Rigor and Imagination, and it's always stuck with me. It's a great, it perfectly captures what I think, in a way, PCC is all about, holding that balance, that potential, that tension of opposites that can bring about a conjunctio of a higher order. And it is especially relevant to astrology, where you need to have a capacity, the symbolic imagination has to be very well developed. I mean, it can come just naturally, as it does to many people, but it still needs to be cultivated for higher levels of discernment. And it's, as we'll see in what I'm going to share with you here, there's lots of ways in which astrologers sometimes do not honor that balance, and there's a shadow that is cast by that lack of holding the balance, holding the tension of opposites. So bringing in the importance of a kind of rigor, by which I mean, a kind of disciplined self-awareness, cultivating that. It's important for the future of the field, for its cultural acceptance, for its dignity, its responsibility. It's important for its own sake, and that of all our friends and clients, and for ourselves as we're looking at our own charts and transits and so forth, to be able to, for example, carry that awareness that I've been seeking to convey each week of the of both archetypal multivalence, that is that kind of rainbow spectrum. What's the words of J. N. Findley, the Neoplatonist philosopher? He said, the iridescent variation of aspect that is characteristic of, and what he was talking about were the Platonic forms, which is another way of understanding the archetypes. But that kind of rainbow spectrum of ways that that each archetype can come through in human experience. And even Saturn, the least kind of rainbowy of the archetypes, has such richness of a rainbow spectrum. I just reread James Hillman's great essay called On Senex Consciousness, which was the first thing I ever read of his over 40 years ago. And he gave us permission. I asked him just a couple of years before he died whether we could reprint it in Archetypal, and Journal of Archetypal Cosmology, and he very generously agreed. We both saw it as an opportunity for a new generation of readers to be able to see this essay, which was originally written in '70. And it's just brilliant. You can see how much astrology, it's on the Senex, which is the Saturn archetype. Senex means the old person, the old man. Our word senator or senescence, senile, the senile senator, all come from that root, Senex. But the Saturn archetype looms behind it, and he is, those of you who know Hillman's work know how just absolutely symbolically agile is his capacity to move between phenomena, between dimensions of being, between disciplines, philosophy, religion, psychology, the arts, politics, and just be showing all these different ways that Saturn and the Senex come through. It's just a brilliant essay. So that's going to be coming out in this next spring annual that Becca and Grant Maxwell are editing, and that will have a lot of contributions by CIS people. So being aware of that archetypal multivalence is key to the ethics of astrology, because here's that tendency that astrologers have had over the centuries to literalize, to get to say this means that, one thing that it means, and this is the result that's going to happen, and that kind of deterministic, literalistic, fatalistic, almost mechanistic mode by which astrological judgments and pronouncements are sometimes uttered with wounding effect on clients. It is as well as a wounding effect on astrology's reputation for anybody who's got a feeling for the greater richness and indeterminacy and creative freedom of not only human beings but of the universe itself. That's the beauty of the archetypal multivalent perspective, is that it honors the creative freedom of the cosmos, being faithful to the archetype and yet not limited by a particular meaning. think of it like I think I used this metaphor in the in Cosmos and Psyche. It's like chordal structures of music, where if you have the piano's covered up, but let's just say you play, three chords. Those chords could be played in so many different ways, different genres, different instruments, different tempos, with different melodies to those chords. And all that is either shaped by other things that are not determined by the planetary alignment, its correlation, nor is it, and not only is it, it's either shaped by other factors like what culture are we in, what historical era, what gender, what family am I born into. All these things are going to play roles, our birth order, but also they'll be determined by our own level of consciousness that we cultivate to bring to the enactment of these archetypal energies that are flowing through us. So that's, and it's William James who pointed out that our creative freedom is ultimately embedded in the universe's creative freedom. That's why it's not a big, that's why he argued for an open universe, and where our sense of freedom is not an illusion. And he went through tremendous challenges psychologically as well as philosophically to get to that point, especially in his late 20s. I think I actually mentioned that in the briefly in my analysis of his Saturn return in Cosmos and Psyche. So in a way, the choice here is between a kind of fatalistic, well, it's between a co-creative participation or what I believe is a kind of fatalistic delusion that can be self-fulfilling. And in terms of astrology's history, it often, this, what I'm calling for, often was not present. And there's a lot of reasons why that has often been the case. And this is, this is where that issue of the hermeneutics of trust versus the hermeneutics of suspicion come in. Everybody knows about, like hermeneutics is like the discipline of understanding our interpretive relationship to texts or to life, to our perception and knowledge. And the hermeneutics of suspicion, which is in a way completely dominates post-modernity, nevertheless is though there's also, because that hermeneutics of suspicion, where you're always skeptical or questioning assumptions and subjective structurings of what we think is real or true, our own depth psychological self-awareness, that's a kind of hermeneutics of suspicion. And where you're saying, is that person really being as off the wall as I'm seeing them, or am I maybe in a complex right now? And that's an ethical act. That's a healthy form of the hermeneutics of suspicion. And so, and think how many times we've, whether it's 5 minutes later or 5 days later, thought back on a perception that we are absolutely riveted by at the time, ready to tear them apart or whatever, and then think, like, what was I quite so upset about there? And that's the, See, the possession state that one's in by a complex, it's like a kind of God that's in charge at that moment. And it creates a whole cosmos that's completely convincing when you're in it. And that's why the Greeks, ancient Greeks, working, in their, like in the Homeric epics, there's not a lot of discussion of self-reflection. It's about which God is in charge of that particular action, who's saying this to the person to do that, or et cetera. And it was probably not a poetic conceit that it's described that way. It's probably a kind of phenomenologically accurate description of how people were experiencing life. The self-reflective, disengaged self, by which I mean disengaged from one's subjectivity enough to be able to reflect on it, hadn't evolved sufficiently yet that one could get a handle on, I feel that complex coming on, and I should make some adjustments. So when we see this played out in, for example, doing an astrological interpretation, where a person might say, well, what I see, I feel in my gut, that's what's real, that's what's objective. Sort of the George W. Bush epistemological orientation. As Stephen what's that? Truthiness. You're right. As Stephen Colbert said, did you know that there are more nerve-ending? He said, he was playing out, and this is in front of George W. Bush at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, and he said, did you know that, he said, George W. Bush is like a real hero of mine, like him, like I speak straight from the gut because I know that's what's true. And did you know that there are more nerve endings in your gut than there are in the brain? Now, you may say that's not true, but that's because you looked it up in a book. Look it up in your gut, and that's what I did, and there's more. Anyway. Okay, now I'm slightly, caricaturing a certain kind of approach to astrology, but that tendency to say, that this is what that means because I'm convinced subjectively about that, or that this is objective, what I'm seeing. We need more critical self-awareness to be brought to the act. It's too important. And one huge reason why it's so important is that when you are, especially if you're a professional astrological counselor, but even if you're just giving, looking at the chart of a friend or family member who doesn't know any astrology, but you do know some, you have potentially, and often actually, in the perception of the person you're talking to, you have a certain aura, a certain charismatic authority that is coming from your ability to somehow read the will of the cosmos in a way that is not accessible to them. And so what you say has impact, and therefore it's going to be, you have all the more care that you need to bring to it. And I think some of the things that we need to be conscious of is, first of all, the multiple factors that are involved, the complexity of any given either a birth chart or even a particular aspect or understanding a particular event or a relationship. And the number of astrological factors that are involved. You just can't, it's too multiple and too complicated to be able to, or complex to be able to give a a simple rendering of judgment. And there's also, the astrological correlations are very resistant to statistical prediction because of the nature of archetypes, multivalence, and their multidimensionality. And I cherish that resistance to being proved by statistics, because that's what gives us, as I mentioned before, that kind of creative freedom. And yet, because the musical chords are still there for people to see, you get to hear the music of the cosmos and move to it and thrill to it, but what dance you're dancing to it, or what melodies you sing to those chordal structures, is to a great extent shaped by your own will and consciousness. In that sense, it's more like it's like jazz in certain respects, day to day, in terms of how we live. And then, in terms of practical strategies for cultivating this greater discernment and care and rigor, study with trustworthy sources. You want to get the tradition, the paradigm, while keeping your critical awareness. Don't take something as valid because you read it in a book, even a book that, and sometimes even especially a book that's, been an authoritative book for hundreds of years. I've mentioned before where that tendency to generalize on the basis of one or two examples that the astrologer noticed, and then they put that into the system, so to speak, teach that. And then it can sometimes get codified and or codified and passed on the tradition in a tradition that gives it an authority that it shouldn't have. You want to test the pronouncements and the tradition against your own experience, and test your own generalizations that you're inclined to make. Bring that self-critical rigor. And then, if you're writing an article or writing a book, or even I think giving or teaching a class or whatever, it's important to state what you have observed and what the texts say, and so that because I guess what I'm recommending is, don't take what a text says that you haven't tested with your own experience, you haven't seen played out a sufficient number of times, so that you're just passing on something as if it's authoritatively, as if it's been your validated experience and conviction based on your own evidence, because then you're just mouthing a textbook, which may be wrong. It's important I'm not saying to not say something that you only know from the textbook, but to say when that's the case. It's like, okay, I haven't seen this. I'm not an expert in hemispheric analysis, for example, which is the part of astrology that looks at the dominance of planets above the horizon versus below the horizon. Unless you've looked at a lot of charts from that perspective, then what you'll be saying will be more coming from what you've read rather than from your own knowledge and experience. Also, when you're testing out hypotheses, I think I mentioned something like this a week or two ago, you want to examine multiple categories of data to see if the correlations hold up. You want to look at, okay, how does that Mars-Saturn come through in a natal chart? How does it come through in personal transits? How does it come through in world transits? How do we see it play out in biographies, in works of art, in non-ordinary states of consciousness? That kind of research. That's where you start getting a sense of a consistency of significance that can give you an assurance after you've seen enough evidence. Can give you an assurance that this is a principle that you can rely on. And speaking of non-ordinary states of consciousness, I think inner exploration is very important as well, so that whether it's deep meditation or holotropic breath work or ayahuasca journeys, to be able to connect, or active imagination in the Jungian frame of reference, or dream work, where you are basically connecting more directly with the archetypal. You get the meanings directly, and that always has to be tested out with, okay, I really see how that Mars-Saturn, whatever, tendency towards frustration or towards muscularity or whatever is, I've experienced it in a non-ordinary state. I just see it so vividly. Well, also check that out in the birth charts of people who would be paradigm cases for those particular qualities. See how it works out in your transits as you attend to them year after year. I think famous paradigm cases that are well documented, just in terms of the biographical material or the historical material, are really crucial for this kind of work, which is why Cosmos and Psyche took the form that it did, and why the different classes that I've taught on the arts, archetypes, art and culture, or the archetypal history of Western thought classes, really are looking at cases that where we all have a sense for who Napoleon was and what he did, or what the Virginia Woolf's biography has such vividness to it that, again, it conveys something that many people can assess. While if you just talk about this one person that you alone have access to the data and everything, and you present that, then other people can't be assessing it. They just have to take your word for it, which isn't always bad if you've shown through all your other references or many of your other references, that you do, that there are things that they can assess for themselves and say, yeah, that really makes sense. Madonna is a really Plutonic person. I can see that in everything I know about the Pluto archetype and how she is on stage, and what kind of a persona and themes are dominant in her chart. In her art, and then I look at her chart, and she's got Pluto conjunct Sun, Pluto conjunct Moon, and Pluto rising. Okay, that's a strongly Plutonic chart, and there's a coherence between my direct experience of her Plutonic nature, just understood archetypally, the way, say, an archetypal psychologist would say, yeah, that's pretty Plutonic. Dionysian, the fascination with the taboo, with the transgressions, with sexuality, with and so forth. it's be steady in your self-observations and your studies. So, like, and I recommend, if you're seriously into this, keep a journal. I mean, it just makes all the difference in the world. And if you keep a journal for enough months and enough years, you really get a handle on how your chart responds to transits, and it gives you a lot more navigational skill in your subsequent use of your subsequent tracking of your transits. Like, okay, I see I've got this transit coming. Probably better to do this kind of activity rather than that kind of activity from my past experience, and seeing how that has worked out in the past, because I've got 5 other times each that particular transit has happened that I've tracked exactly what kinds of things happened in my life, because it increases your navigational ability in life. But that also means to study and preserve the anomalies. Every good scientist does this. Sometimes something will happen, plenty of times something will happen that you can't see, at least at first. How does that fit my transits? And it's important to not just block those out, because those are often going to be where your knowledge is going to get most stimulated in the long run, where you're going to learn something really important. I mean, to give just a very simple example, I learned astrology with a very, with a conventional understanding of fairly narrow orbs for transits, 3 degrees before exact, up to exact, and kept really close track. But I kept noticing that things happened often like 2 degrees after exact, or 4 to 5 degrees before exact, depending on what planets, what aspects, etc. And in the beginning, because they didn't fit the paradigm that I was working with, I tended to either be just made slightly uncomfortable by, well, this didn't happen right within that framework that I was expecting, or either there'd be discomfort, or I would just not attend to it adequately. But if you do attend to it, as I learned to do, I started realizing how the transits worked, and I started keeping very close track of the timing of when the waveform started coming in, when it tended to recede. That's just a very simple example, but pay attention to the anomalies, and they will bring forth treasures later that you can't anticipate. So it's always a matter of sort of testing your theories in the light of data, and then the reason for that is that you're going to be examining the data in the light of your theories all the time. So you've got to do this, what's called the hermeneutic circle, this kind of recursive feedback loop, in order to not get stuck inside the paradigm. And now calling on that issue that I started with, of bringing in sufficient reflexivity or self-awareness, hermeneutics of suspicion, to one's own judgments. Watch for projection when it comes to astrological assessments. One is the projection of one's wishes and one's fears. You can easily read them into the data. This is something that becomes particularly problematic if one is a professional astrologer, and there's a potential there for things that one hasn't worked out in one's own life, let's say one's relationship to Saturn and Saturn transits, or Pluto transits. And then when you're giving a reading, you can cloak your interpretation of what you're seeing there with your own unresolved emotional issues around that particular archetypal complex, and infect the other person with your anxieties. Oh no, you've got this coming up, and that's you've just basically constrained their existential possibilities to the extent that they've absorbed your fear, which you've read into the interpretation as a kind of objective assessment. Which, remember, you've got a kind of high priest, high priestess role, even in that muted way that we do when we've just been studying astrology for a couple months, but we know enough to look to be able to say things about, the chart of a friend who's asking, and you've already got that aura that can be projected onto you. And especially important is to not get caught up in that aura. The inflation of being the high priest or high priestess, the authority who, like, yeah, I'm in the know. Doctors and like physicians can be terribly prone to this, as many nurses will point out. And there's kind of a beautiful movement right now within the medical profession to bring that awareness of how many mistakes physicians make, and beautifully honest and self-revealing articles and books by highly regarded, really distinguished physicians and surgeons, talking about their failures or certain professional tendencies that they observe that keep bad habits in the professional milieu. It's having a great effect. I think this is, again, part of that nobility of the postmodern era that we're in, is that that heightened authority that the professional in their white coat, or the high priest, or the pharaoh held in the society, is now there's this emphasis on, we're all human, we're all fallible, we all have a shadow. Another thing is to be conscious of that tendency we can have to want to control to use our understanding of astrological factors to control our lives rather than to participate more self-awarely and creatively and appreciatively. Ego control is very strong of a temptation. Remember, anything, whether it's anything that, including things of tremendous, great gifts, like a religious tradition, just like the astrological discipline, can be appropriated by the armored defensive ego, executive agency functions that are basically trying to maximize payoff. Okay, and so using the astrology for that purpose is always a kind of temptation. And of course, it's going to blow up in one's face. That's the beauty of the unpredictable trickster cosmos. But the the short story I had you read by Kafka is just a brilliant example of that attempt to basically keep the entire world under control, and how ultimately futile that quest is. And here's something in particular that I want us to be, as people in the kind of countercultural, spiritually informed, enchanted universe, counterculture that we are mostly part of here. There can be the need to live in a meaningful universe, which we all have that need, but that need can trump, pardon the expression, our capacity for discerning judgment. And one sees this sometimes in astrological articles where they're just kind of promiscuously drawing on all these astrological factors to explain, well, this had to happen because Jupiter, the ruler of the 5th house, is going across the ruler of the 10th house, and that's why, of course, this happened. And there's just this, there could be a lot of factors as to why one might go in that interpretive route, but I'm urging us to be aware of that one proclivity we have, that's an underlying metaphysical presupposition that because we live in a meaningful universe, we're pretty convinced about it, we can sometimes, there's still a kind of hunger to see it proved over and over again, and therefore that can sometimes overcome our careful assessment of a given situation. I think patience is a very big virtue in this area. I think the most helpful approach to this kind of study is a kind of active receptivity. It's like an openness to the pattern revealing itself, and but not over eagerly imposing that pattern on the evidence. That's the trick. Be open to being there, and ultimately be open to letting it reveal itself rather than imposing it. That's where that, for example, compulsion to find the meaning can actually obscure the meaning, because you're basically projecting your need for meaning onto the actual, and you're not letting the actual reveal itself. That's a kind of projection. And the opposite kind of projection is where you just assume there is not a meaning there. Astrology does not work. Synchronicities are just, of all kinds, are just projections of our need for meaning in a random universe. Of course, some things are just going to happen that just look quite meaningfully constellated, but believe me, we live in a random universe, and you're projecting your need for me. Okay, that's another form of the I-it relationship, where you're not listening to the other. You're projecting your conviction about what the other is, namely, it's just a random, mechanistic, material phenomenon that has no capacity for secreting meanings and purposes. So those are the two, I think of them as like Charybdis and, in Homer's Odyssey, they have to go between these two dangerous monsters in the sea, these like the rocks that cause shipwrecks, and it's Scylla and Charybdis, and the Charybdis is that tendency to just out of the need for meaning to just project it there, and the Scylla, it's Scylla, though in Greek it's a kappa, so it's Scylla. Anyway, would be like the projection that it's definitely without meaning because we live in a random mechanistic universe. Like the patience to being open to a pattern revealing itself, and with an eye to that opening. It's very much like a love relationship. If you're absolutely convinced that the two extremes that you want to avoid, or they're not even extremes, the two sides, the two poles that you need to navigate between are, on the one hand, the projection of your need to be loved by this person and your conviction that this person loves you, as in the what's that word I'm looking for, where you obsessively follow somebody, stalking, like the stalker who's absolutely convinced that we're meant to be together. I know it, and that person is not allowing the stalked object of their interest to reveal who they actually are. They're projecting their need onto the other and then reifying it. But the other side would be nobody's really capable of love. Certainly not of loving me. I'm not going to be loved. I don't care what you're saying about you love me. I don't believe it. And that's another form of that skeptical. It's a projection of one's own. In this case, you've turned. The reason this is an I-it relationship is that you've turned them into a blank screen upon which you're projecting your subjective, unconscious needs, meanings, complexes. And each one is a projection, whether it's the skeptical, there's no way this is going to, you're even capable of this, which is what the disenchanted person, the disenchanted scientist or philosopher does to the whole cosmos. You're not capable of meaning and purpose. That's a human phenomenon. That's an I-it relationship. But then the other side would be just projecting one's need for meaning or sense of destiny, etc., onto a person who is, hey, wait a minute, you're a really cool person, or I thought you were up until this minute, but I'm not in love with you. I'm sorry. That kind of lack of I-thou relating to the other. And every love relationship that is going to be really fulfilling and nourishing to us is going to be one that comes of its own accord, and not through our manipulative actions or obliging them to feel a certain way. It's something that it's a dance. It's something one is inviting the possibility of, and the good astrologer invites the possibility that there could be an archetypal correlation between what event we're looking at or what quality we're considering in a person and the movements of the planets or their birth chart. And that openness, informed by a tradition that is carrying a deep a tradition of meanings that the planets are carrying, allows that possibility to emerge. Let reality teach us how astrology works, not vice versa. And that requires a lot of sensitive perception of the context, of nuances, of multiple levels of meaning, situational awareness, which is a phrase that Sully Sullenberg, Sully Sullenberger, I think is his name, the guy who flew the, I was just telling you guys about him, I think a week or two ago, the guy who flew the American Airlines flight and saved it from, crashing. And he had the aspect that is potentially connected to like technological mishaps and so forth, the Saturn square Uranus, but his whole life had been, he was one of the great aviation safety teachers of his profession. And anyway, it's an example of how a hard aspect is actually this real gift in potentially. And that phrase, situational awareness, is something he taught as part of safety strategies. In general, what I'm calling for is more like, if you're a fan of the Sherlock Holmes short stories and novels that Conan Doyle wrote, I'm calling for more of a Sherlock Holmes mentality than the Scotland Yard kind of mentality that has that sensitive perception that is basically drawing on multiple cognitive modes, like our senses, our reason, but also our the aesthetic dimension is very important in astrological assessments. Our sense of history, our emotional and empathic capacity, our knowledge of the context within which something's happening, our psychological self-awareness, all these things play a role coming together in our coming to a conclusion. So I'll finally just say that probably the most important single thing I would recommend when one is giving a reading to somebody else, or even thinking about your own upcoming transits, for example, it's do no harm, which is the medical dictum, but it's nobody should leave, including yourself, from a self-interpretation, an astrological assessment of your own chart and transits, but also, especially if you're doing it for others, nobody should leave your presence, your counsel, feeling more discouraged about their life, more limited about their possibilities than when they came in, or else one has really failed. And that's unfortunately has happened a lot of times from people who went to see professional astrologers. Every profession has its shadow, but astrology is certainly not without. Is certainly not an exception to that. And I think, just as a general principle, just remember that like every birth chart has potential greatness, and everyone has potential nobility in it. I'm absolutely convinced of that, and it's a priori judgments otherwise are really unethical, I think, and also epistemologically naive. That's the big thing. They're just, it's not just an unethical or a mean or an unkind thing. It's like it's a sign of epistemological lack of self-awareness. It's and when and yes, we all have, let's say, challenging, difficult aspects in our chart, and we've seen them play out plenty of times, let's say, after you've been studying a while, and so forth. But the idea is not to so much is not to free yourself from your chart. It's to live out your chart on a new level, to actualize the potential of the chart in a new way, or in a way that is brings out the most life-enhancing possibilities, because every single symbolic structure in the chart has both life constraining or destructive possibilities, as well as life-enhancing and creative possibilities. That's part of that rainbow spectrum, and the idea is to bring that awareness of our creative freedom and responsibility with respect to that indeterminacy that is in the birth chart. Okay, any thoughts, comments, or questions about that little sermon? Please. Here.
It's a bit of a tricky question for me, like I'm not sure exactly, but to somebody in a modern consciousness, trying to describe multivalence, multidimensionality seems like one big gambit to just avoid accountability. So how do you address that suspicion?
It's one has that's very very good point, and it is a it's a point that is also relevant to, for example, gene expression, that is genetic proclivities. Like it's because one has a particular gene doesn't necessarily result in this particular consequence, but there seems to be a greater potential in that direction. And that's the same thing that's true about, let's say, going through a Saturn square Saturn transit, that there's a greater potential there. But no, I want to get closer to what you're pointing out. This is what Hillman is talking about in terms of cultivating an archetypal eye. It's or I think it's T.S. Eliot who talks about how one has to have a feeling for metaphor as one's writing poetry, for example, and like how far one can take it, what is its range of its amplitude. If you have a deep sense of Saturn, let's say, and a deep sense of Venus, archetypally, symbolically, you can recognize a tremendous range of ways, and yet the poetic, symbolic capacity we have in our cognition can recognize whether the particular quality we're talking about is relevant to the specific archetypal complex we're looking at, or it just doesn't fit. And it's a kind of competence. It's a kind of imaginative, archetypal, symbolic competence. A disciplined imagination was the term I remember using in the epilogue of Passion of the Western Mind to describe how we access deeper meanings in our own. It's not just, if we're trying to understand the universe, it's not just um, a distanced, objectifying, rational sensory assessment, empirical assessment of what we're looking at. The participatory epistemology that I was drawing on in that epilogue, that comes out of particularly the German idealists and romantics, transcendentalists. It is a recognition. Steiner has a good stuff on this. Basically, one has to the cultivation of one's inner life is crucial, and the cultivation of a capacity for symbolic discernment, so that you are able to recognize that iridescent variation of aspect that is still faithful to the core principle of that particular archetype. And it's an aesthetic imaginative judgment. And this is why it's why a computer would find a very hard time, making being able to adequately reflect or perceive the full richness and amplitude of archetypal potentialities. And one sees that not everything goes, and it's not a matter of anything goes. The phenomenon will be recognized as faithful to that God, faithful to, and you kind of have to have a feeling for it, which can take years for it, but in some people can come very quickly as you study the sources that are good sources, carrying the tradition in a good way, that's faithful to the archetypal domain. But it's also it can come quickly to people, I think, who may have been astrologers last lifetime, or they may just they have some intuitive access to the archetypal dimension that where the meanings they just have a feeling for it. And then there's other people who, I don't want to name any names, but there are people even within the transpersonal theory world that just think more like an engineer, where it takes a poetic sensibility that is intimately intertwined with a capacity for rigor. This is that rigor and imagination tension of opposites that I was bringing up in the beginning. If you go to the, I think it's part 3 of Cosmos and Psyche, where I have a chapter on archetypal multivalence. And does anybody have the book here that I could just, thanks, look at the chapter titles? There's one in particular, it's at the end of Through the Archetypal Telescope, and there's 2 chapters at the very end there. Altogether, you're looking at like about 12, 13 pages. It's called Archetypal Coherence and Concrete Diversity, and then the following one is called Assessing Patterns of Correlation, and it really tries to address exactly this issue of, let me just see if I have here the, okay, yeah, here we go. Given the considerable range, this is on page 133 if you're happening to want to reference it. Given the considerable range of, I had just been talking about the constancy and the multivalence were evident in the data in subtle and intricate interplay. It was to me consistently remarkable. And then I say, but Given the considerable range of possible manifestation observed for any given archetypal complex associated with a specific planetary configuration, the question arises, with such diversity, how genuine are the archetypal categories? This is pretty much just what you're asking. This, of course, evokes that critical issue that has dominated the history of Western philosophy, which is the problem of universals. Are the archetypal categories rooted in something beyond our local projections, or are they merely arbitrary constructions of the categorizing mind? Are they perhaps no more than figments of the metaphorical imagination? And I answer then, only a range of data and a depth of research commensurate with the profundity of these issues can provide the possibility of their resolution. And in the following chapters, I set forth an initial survey of evidence that I believe may help to do so. If I may anticipate here, after intensive analysis of a much larger body of evidence during the past 30 years, I've become fully persuaded that these archetypal categories are not merely constructed, but are in some sense both psychological and cosmological in nature. They provide a comprehensive conceptual structure that makes intelligible the complexities of human experience in a manner unmatched by any other approach I have encountered. One more sentence. The existence of constantly diverse inflections of the same archetypal principles seems to reflect a dynamic indeterminacy of formal patterning in the nature of things that permits the simultaneous coexistence of both meaningful coherence and creative unpredictability in human life. I think the closest parallel I can point us to is, again, music. Good jazz musicians can do an extraordinary amount of improvisatory play, and yet are able to remain within a relationship that is faithful to a kind of archetypal core, which in this case might be Coltrane or Miles Davis or doing My Favorite Things. And like, where do the original chords go? But everybody, all the musicians who are that are playing in that jazz ensemble are in sync with each other because they're following. They can keep in relationship to the core chordal structure while being very free in where they're going with it, and taking and bringing it even to new creative diversity than has ever been done before. And that's part of the joy of the music, is that you're constantly holding that balance between expectation and surprise. And that's what life is that constant balance between expectation. If it was constantly like surprise every split second, we'd be just in a chaos of like, but there's certain structural solidities, or in this case, like archetypal formal constancies that nevertheless manifest in this great creative diversity of ways. And this is the point that Jung is getting to in those early quotations where he said, a kind of fluid interpenetration belongs to the very nature of all archetypes. They can, when you're trying to describe them, they can only be roughly circumscribed at best. Their living meaning comes out more from their presentation as a whole than from a single formulation. That's why I gave so many different examples of, here's all the ways Uranus and Pluto can work out when they come together. Sexual revolution, but also technological periods of accelerated technological advance. Landing on the moon, but also Woodstock. You know, that kind of, like, and showing they're all faithful, nevertheless, to this Promethean-Dionysian combination. And so, as Jung says, and this is Jung's quote, every attempt to focus them more sharply is immediately punished by the intangible core of meaning losing its luminosity. No archetype can be reduced to a simple formula. It is a vessel which we can never empty and never fill. It persists throughout the ages and requires interpreting ever anew. The archetypes are the imperishable elements of the unconscious, but they change their shape continually. That's perfect. That exactly describes what I'm talking about. And if you get a chance to read the essay that I was talking about earlier by James Hillman called On Senex Consciousness, which is about Saturn, that's going to be in the Archive Journal soon, or if you own a copy of Senex and Puer, the book of James Hillman's collected writings. There's a volume called Senex and Puer, Puer being the eternal child, that has it in there. You see a mind in action, Hillman's, that is just brilliantly showing all the different ways in which the Saturn archetype can manifest, and as the high god of our culture, making the god of judgment, 10 Commandments, expulsion from the Garden of Eden, the firmness of moral principle, etc. And then, but it's also the part of our complex that never changes, no matter how much we work on it, that is resistant. It's also the leaden, the heavy. It's also the tradition. It's also old age, but it's also the child who is locked into having to have the formula repeated exactly right, or they will be quite upset if you don't repeat the story just the way you told it last time. No, that's not how it went, Mom. That all the different ways the Saturn can come through. And so some of those examples are mine, but that's what Hillman's doing in this essay. It's just like he is just swimming in the rich sea of archetypal flora and fauna, and he's just a great describer. And the essay is almost a test of whether one has that capacity. I'm sure there are certain kind of logical positivist type minds that would read this and go, what's going on here? Where's he going next? And I don't get there's no coherence to this. While another person is just like, this all makes such beautiful sense. It just aesthetically, intellectually is bringing so much into coherence that is otherwise seemingly unrelated. It's a good test of the archetypal eye, or of the symbolic, the capacity for symbolic discernment. So that's the best I can do with your excellent question. Okay, let's take our break, and we'll come back at 1:45, and we'll go right into the movies that we've built up. I need to go to The Matrix and Frida, and there was one question somebody had about the remaining about On the Waterfront. Thank you.